Hi, everyone. My name is Diane Janes. I am a faculty member with Thompson Rivers University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today.
And I'm Chris Crowley. I'm currently working at the University of British Columbia. I'm a manager of the learning design team. I've been a member of AMTEC since early 90s. I served on the board as the awards director for a number of years. I was a Commonwealth Relations Trust bursar. Most recently, I was chair of the AMTEC Trust. So yeah, Rick, I'm going to bring up the consent form here. Well, give me a moment while I share the screen. Share screen. Now to find that. Share. Okay, Rick, are you able to see the
I can. Yeah,
okay.
I can, Chris.
Is that all good for you? Have you had a chance to read it?
It's excellent. Yeah, I had a chance to look at it. I'm right on board with all of it. If you need me to say you have my permission, you have my permission. And I also absolve you of anything stupid or incorrect that I say in the next little bit.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing and over to you, Diane.
Thank you. And like Chris, I've been around AMTEC from the late 1980s, early 1990s. I have my wonderful master's thesis supervisor, Mary Kennedy, who introduced me to AMTEC in Newfoundland in the 90s. So this project is a project that was started by myself and Chris Crowley and Dr. Cindy Ives out of Athabasca University, who isn't with us today. She and Chris and I recognize that next year is the 50th anniversary of AMTEC. And it is also, to some extent, the history of educational technology and the use of educational media in the country. And we set about to create an archival history, if you like, of the AMTEC work. Part of the work that we're doing with this is to call on past members looking for curated and collected materials to start to digitize that collection and house it in a place that allows future educational technologists and historians to listen to and understand the world that surrounded educational technology during the early days. And for that, we're doing these interviews with our knowledge keepers, and Rick Schwier is definitely one of those knowledge keepers. So, Rick, with your permission, I ask you to introduce yourself. And welcome.
Thanks, Diane and Chris. We go way back, don't we? My name's Rick Schwier. I am a retired professor from the University of Saskatchewan. I've been part of AMTEC forever, it seems. I came to Canada as a 28-year-old terrified assistant professor, and was introduced almost immediately to people in AMTEC. Barry Brown, who was looking after me and our program at the time, suggested that AMTEC was a really important place for me, a really important organization for me to get involved in, and because I would get to know the people across Canada who were doing things in this field. And oh, was he right? Over the years, I served as the editor of CJEC, the Canadian Journal of Educational Communication, now CJLT, and also served earlier on the editorial board of Media Message as it transitioned to CJEC. So a long history there. Served as president for a year, and have just generally been involved with the lives and interests of people across the country who've been involved in this organization. So that's kind of a nutshell rundown of who I might be related to this.
Excellent.
Um,
So go ahead, Chris.
well, no, you can go ahead, Diane. Sorry.
Okay. So you were in the higher education sector. So you worked at the University of
Mhm.
Saskatchewan for, I would say, most of your career. Um, so what was the educational technology landscape like in that time when you were in your late 20s and moving from the United States, which probably had a lot of sort of AECT emphasis, and then the move to Canada and the Canadian version, if you like.
You know, that's a great angle to come at some of this stuff with. I'm really glad you guys are doing that because even those of you who were lucky enough to be Canadian, born Canadians, um, uh, we've all been influenced by our relationship with AECT. We learned from it. We grew through it. They've benefited from us, and so we've had a particular relationship with that organization. And that is where I started. I was a graduate student and at Indiana University and going to AECT conferences at that time and just kind of feeling my way into the field. And then when I moved to Canada and took a job on on basically a 2-year plan, I thought, okay, well, I'll launch my academic career in Canada. That'll be exotic, right? And so moved to Saskatchewan, and 45 years later, I'm still here because I fell in love with it within 6 months, and I knew it was the right country, the right province, the right organization, the right institution that I was working with, and I was around the right people. It just felt right from the beginning, I got to say. And it was different in fundamental ways from AECT. AECT was it was huge. It was in those years, they would pull in thousands of people to their conferences, to their annual conferences. And you would show up in Atlantic City and you'd be surrounded by 5,000 people. Well, good luck navigating that and working your way, just to know where you are and how you make sense of this field was challenging. And also they had a really kind of a commercial feel sometimes. I'm not putting them down for that, but they were very involved in the industry of educational technology. And so they would have a trade fair that would take up a football field.
Hmm.
And it was impressive, but also lent a particular orientation to what they were doing. But they also had really strong researchers and leaders in the field. So, you had this kind of strange mixture of stuff. I got a funny story or two if you ever want them about one in Philadelphia that went bad. but they had they had they invited a lot of people into their organization, and so those people were often at odds with each other about where was the emphasis, where should we be placing the emphasis, and how did the academics get along with the people in the trades and in the service sector and all of that. Came to Canada, and I can't remember what year it was for sure. It would have been 1979 or 80. I went to my first AMTEC conference. So I came in at 78. So I think it was 79, and it was in Edmonton. And Barry Brown said, "Get in the car. We're going to Edmonton." And it was smaller, more intimate, more welcoming, more of everything that I liked about our field. I started meeting people right away who were fascinating and dug in and equally committed to issues of educational technology right across the country. And there seemed to be much less of a bifurcation of interest between academics and service. People were all scholars in the field, and people who were working in production ends or administrative ends of educational technology at across the country, we're contributing real important scholarship to how we looked at things. So there seemed to be less of a hierarchy, discrimination, disagreements about that sort of thing. And so I just found that wonderful, and it enriched the conversation at our conferences. I think I really remember them that way, that we were places of ideas, and we were a little bit different in orientation too from the United States. I think I'm going to make a sweeping generalization here, and somebody could shoot it down, but we seem to be more interested in the communication and media literacy and media side and media, the messaging side of things and the learning side of things than and I guess that comes from communication theory and learning theory that evolved here. Than they had in the States. In the States, they were much more tie-ins with industry, tie-ins with doing instructional design and training environments and doing all of that sort of thing. In ours, we were interested in film, in discussions of those kinds of things. So I'm sorry, that's a very rambling discussion, but that was kind of a big takeaway I had very early on, that we were an organization about the people in the organization.
It sounds like,
well, go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like McLuhan had more of an impact potentially on the Canadian side.
I think so. I do, Diane. I think, and I think that resonated through our field, because when we had industry tie-ins, they were with NFB, right? Mm-hmm. Or government. We're heavily influenced by that orientation, I think, to the role of educational technology and what we do. And I always felt really great about that. And like I say, we had great scholars right across this country who were perhaps not in academic, traditional academic positions, tenured professors in places. You take Ross Mutton, for instance, and the great work that he did on copyright for us. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was invaluable work that influenced our role in the conversation nationally with government and other groups about that important thing. So
yeah,
it was. Go ahead.
Sorry, I that was one of the things I wanted to ask you, was what was the impact of AMTEC on Canadian educational technology, and one of the copyright, the work that Ross did was one of the ones I was thinking of too.
Yeah,
and
I think that was a seminal piece of work that he was doing then. Yeah. Copyright was in a state of flux. Everybody was using everything, and nobody was crediting anybody for that use or paying for it. And we were pretty unapologetic about it. One of the first articles I ever wrote was a soft piece for, I don't know, an unknown journal that I hope has disappeared. And it was called Copyright, a Call to Civil Disobedience. Which was really a dumb position to take as a young academic.
I don't know. Young academics are often quite radical, wanting to see what they can shift and wanting to see where their boundaries are.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's a good thing.
Anyhow, yeah, I think AMTEC was yearning for a long time to be in the national conversation on all kinds of issues. I think we had uneven success at that. I can't say specifically about particular things, but we had many influential people who were in conversations. It wasn't always tied to AMTEC, though. I mean, I think of Danielle Fertosky at our own program and the kind of wonderful work she was doing in distance learning at the time. Broadcast television, narrowcast stuff. And but she was kind of a mover and shaker and making a lot of great things happen. But I don't know how much of that AMTEC ever was identified as a parent organization for. We were, I guess a little Canadian, that we were quite humble about who we were and what we were doing.
Yeah.
So we didn't kind of insinuate ourselves aggressively into conversations, but we were there.
Yeah. We talked to Maureen Barron.
Yeah.
And she was talking about the networking, the conversations, and I guess it was all kind of underneath these conversations, but they're all kind of building this foundation to support educational technology by sharing knowledge and experience and networking.
Yeah. And Maureen was right. Oh, when she came along, she really knew how to be involved in those conversations. Her work at NFB, of course, and then
yes,
the people she knew and the influence she had there. We immediately translated. Think of the stuff that's happened, Chris, at UBC, and how that's found its way into the national conversation. Knowledge network on through, and it is, all great stuff. I mean, right across the country. And that's an interesting thing, I think, about AMTEC and its role in all of this, is we were sampling great people from right across this country. I mean, really, it was right across. Look at Newfoundland, at Memorial University with, you mentioned Mary Kennedy. And then she brought you into the fold, Diane, and you guys ran the journal at a very critical time for the journal. And looked after that. So Newfoundland, Genevieve Gallant, right? And the wonderful stuff that she did from that area. We had Central Canada. We had Ross Mutton, Al LeBlanc, Richard Lewis. I don't know if Richard Lewis. I remember
Richard. Yes.
But he looked after Media Message forever, and was really influential in shaping the scholarly conversation when it was very young and growing in the field. So in Central Canada, we had people, although I've always lamented that we didn't have enough people from Central Canada. We did in Montreal, of course, we had Concordia University and all of that. That was a flagship program. I mean, they had the only PhD program at the time, if I remember correctly. So Concordia and McGill had some people involved too. We had Bob Bernard and Gary Boyd and Rick Schmidt and Mariella Tovar and Cheryl Amundsen and Steve Shaw. All of those kinds of people were central to doing great things in the field. And then you move west, and I think that's really kind of weird. Everything's kind of gravitated west, or it did for a while anyway. Oh, and by the way, in Central Canada, Maureen Barron, of course, we already mentioned her, but we had such interest in the West, I mean, which I think was unusual. And we had weird things like Saskatchewan had a pretty good little program, but we were the little engine that could, right? But we had one, and we were trying to be involved in that nationally. And so Saskatchewan, I mean, it didn't even have 1 million people, and somehow we got involved in larger concerns with Barry Brown, Len Proctor from our program. Yes, great. The late Len Proctor, should say, and then I don't know, Dennis Linka in Winnipeg. In Alberta, we had Dave Mappin and Katie Campbell. The wonderful things that were happening right across this country, and how those people connected. But again, it was people, right? These people all knew each other, and I think that gave the unique flavor to AMTEC, so that even when there was a little dust up or a little argument over this or that, people respected each other. They found compromise. They found ways to have conversations, and tried to move a common agenda forward. So,
yeah, you talk about it being broad, but I'm wondering, it was also deep in terms of it involved industry, it involved government, it involved universities, K-12, colleges, and not only was it wide, but it was deep.
You're quite right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Chris. Yeah. And I think that that really lent a special flavor to AMTEC because when you think about it being deep, people were talking to each other all through that core of influence.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so it wasn't just academics sitting off in a corner talking to each other, and then educational developers or instructional designers off in another room talking to each other. It was everybody talking to each other.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think that's the way I remember it anyway. Maybe I've got rose-colored glasses on or something, but
It's how I remember it. I remember going to some conferences and you'd see a presentation from some school board, some school district. And you think, my goodness, look what they're doing. And it was really, really impressive.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I saw a presentation by Al LeBlanc, and he was so interested in K-12. And we ended up bringing him out to Saskatchewan to talk to our faculty because I thought, we're having no luck, getting educational technology into our programs and into the conversation at our own university. But maybe if we bring in an outsider from Ontario or something, maybe he can. And he was great. He spent a couple of days with our faculty and really did help us a great deal.
Yeah. So picking up on Chris's question about the depth and the breadth of AMTEC, so you led AMTEC for a period of time. And so I guess I have a two-part question. And one is sort of what was your biggest challenge when you were sort of at the helm? And then over the 20 or 30-year span of that sort of late 70s to early 2000s, what was, do you think, Canada's greatest EdTech challenge? So sort of a two-parter.
I think it's a challenge. One of the challenges, there are many, of course, but I think one of the challenges we continue to face is how to involve the Francophone community in what we do, because they're doing great stuff. I learned that, and I'm sure you experienced it too when you were working on the editorial staff of CJEC. That's when I first ran across this, that we were having a lot of trouble reaching out to the Francophone community and getting them involved in even submission of research to our journals and things like that. Even though we were a bilingual journal, it was really a struggle to actualize that. And I think now we're probably facing the same issue with Indigenous communities. How do we respect in very real ways those traditions and those communities, and how do we get people who have traditionally been outside looking in to our organization, how do we welcome them in? And how do we do that respectfully? How do we do that without sounding like we're going to do a favor for but I think that would enrich what we do. And these are very big sweeping concerns, I know, but I think it's something that is both very difficult and very important to accomplish in the long run. And I hope people can, because we had some luck getting some French submissions, for instance, to CJEC in those years. But I needed reviewers who could actually look at those pieces and be willing to serve on the editorial board, a review board of a journal that was just really getting going in those conversations.
So it's interesting you're saying that, because I'm co-editing right now IJEDE, which used to be the Canadian Journal of Distance Ed, which is one of the two journals that CNIE now supports, the CJLT and IJEDE. And we're finding it, interestingly enough, we need to find reviewers who have experience from other countries, specifically Africa. We're getting a lot of articles from young and emerging African
Mhm.
academics,
Mhm.
and to be again respectful and understand their context. One would like to have some of the reviewers from that same series of regions. So yes, it's language and it's
Yeah,
culture and it's experience and it's personal history to be able to bring those things, those lenses to the conversation.
you bet. And I remember we were getting some submissions from that part of the world where they were in a completely different place with
Yeah,
educational technology, right? And
yeah,
in some cases, they were just emerging with
yes, yes.
and
Or
re-experiencing.
their cultural setting just changed their
Yeah,
dynamic, which would be not be found perhaps in a Canadian setting.
right. And so they were almost uh, reintroducing us to some ideas that we'd already dealt with, but there was a reason to look at those again. But if we sat back and thought, well, we better have a look at radio and how it's distributed in
Mhm.
some of these countries and how they've moved that. Anyway, I'm using that as a wild example, but um, I found CJEC to be a real eye opener. The work with that group, and um, I'm sure you did too, Diane. It's
Very much so. Yeah.
yeah.
And I was lucky enough for, when Mary was editor, I was lucky enough for her to appoint me book review editor. So I
Mhm.
had two layers. Not only did I get to sort of function within the editorial space, but I was also book review editor at the time, which anyone listening to this would be quite amazed. Book publishers sent you two copies.
Yeah, yeah,
And so one went on your desk so that you had a copy to refer when the editorial came back or the conversation came back, and one that went out to the editor or to the writer. And I remember at one point Tony Bates coming and looking at my bookshelf, and I'm saying, "Why are you looking at my bookshelf?" He said, "Because your books are better than mine. I need to find I need to find this for my writing, and you have a copy." And so
and they were free.
it was hilarious. Yes, it was quite a bit of fun. But today the industry is a little bit tighter in terms of
Yeah.
how they release the materials.
Well,
So
and that journals have changed so much. I mean,
mhm.
when we were doing the journal, I mean, I don't know how much of a history you want me to run down on this kind of thing, but I'm sure you have or will talk to Bob Bernard. Um,
We have
We
done
have,
that.
yes. Yeah.
okay, he did a marvelous thing. I mean, media message was uh, it was a good introduction to how you create a non-referee journal. I mean, it was a place where you could publish ideas and you could think through some things, and it was really good. Richard Lewis did a fine job of putting that together for years, and then Dennis Linka came along and he said, let's rename it to CJEC and let's have it half refereed and half non-refereed. I don't know
Mhm.
whether you remember that, but it was
No, I
but
don't.
it was actually split down the middle. He had the idea that, well, we may not have enough for a full-blown um, referee journal, but we could make this a good combination. And probably the organization only has an appetite for one journal, so let's do that.
Mhm.
And so when Bob came on board, he said, "No, we need an academic presence that's clear. Referees start to get into that area, internationally." And I think he was dead right. And so he did that over, I think, 3 or 4 years. He brought that in. He got it funded. He got a lot of excellent things. Got a review board together. Got all that structure, that infrastructure for an academic journal. Can you imagine? I mean, even putting it out in those days, there weren't many outlets. You had ETR&D, I forget what its label was at the time, out of AMTEC, and you had, educational technology that was really just a non-referee journal out of New Jersey.
Yeah.
And you had some academic journals. You had instructional development at the time that got folded into ETR&D later. And yeah, so you had these substantial physical presence of journals that meant you had to have the money to do that. You had to have an organization behind you that was willing to invest in that. And so there were very few outlets. So getting published was a competition, right?
Yes.
And so we got in at that level. We were able to start attracting. Once we got known, we started attracting some things. So Bob looked after that for 4 years and then handed it off to me. And I knew that one of my real roles in that was not to get all splashy, but literally to start building the stability and the influence of CJEC and getting it out there and attracting things from other groups, right, that didn't know they existed at the time. So that was really my biggest challenge as editor, was to try and stabilize CJEC. And I think that you and Mary followed with that right after me. I handed it off to Mary, and she had the same vision that I did. We need to move it to a different part of the country. I know different people than you do. We've got to stabilize this thing and keep it going and keep it out there as an important voice in the academy. Well, I think it did. I think by the time you guys did, and then Dave Mappin moved in, and it was released a little less frequently for a while there, and then but when you look at the work more recently that's gone on with that, I mean, with Heather Kanuka and Michelle Jacobson, and some of the work that's gone on has just been wonderful. That it's really an important journal now.
Yes. And it has because of the work of Marty Cleveland Lewis, who is now currently the editor.
I should have mentioned Marty. Yeah.
It's open source, it's online, which means it now attracts not just Canadian interest, but interest from academics around the world. So
and now it's competing with so many more journals. I mean,
yes,
hundreds.
Even in Canada.
Yeah. Like I say, it used to be nice and confined. Nice and confined. It actually wasn't. It was confining the voice of educational technology. But still, I mean, it used to be this big, and now it's, my goodness, the number of journals that are available.
Just maybe switching topics a bit. I'm wondering about, unless Diane, did you have another question around the journal? Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was just, okay. I mean, we talked about the 50th anniversary of AMTEC, and of course, AMTEC and CADE merged in 2007. I wonder if you were involved in that process, what that process was like.
Of joining the two?
Yes, the merger.
What two joining? I was involved in early conversations before anybody wanted to have the conversations about it with Bill Hunter. And we actually flew a couple of these, we just fly an airplane through a paper airplane through a board meeting and say, this might be a good move. And people just there wasn't a lot of uptake on that at the time. And CADE had developed a really strong following. They had a good following, and they actually drew away from our group a fair bit, if I remember in the years. I don't remember the specifics of it, but I think we had the sense that we were losing membership to CADE when people were picking one over the other. And so I think there was interest in seeing whether those groups came together. And I think CADE was interested in it too, some group. But then boards of directors and voluntary organizations feel a lot of ownership to their institution or their organizations, right? And so those conversations in those years didn't go very far. In fact, there was a resounding thud on the tables, boards of directors. So I was thrilled to find out that those organizations finally came to an understanding of
Mhm.
each other and the important things they could bring to each other.
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
made it just stronger. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
I can remember being on the board of CADE a couple of times before 2007, and the same thing.
Mhm.
Somebody would bring the idea to the group, and
Mhm.
they'd all, go, yeah, okay, these are good ideas, but we're not ready. It's not, it's not a good time.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think those rumblings, those conversations between the various boards and membership was ongoing for quite a while before everything settled down to actually start to negotiate.
Yeah. You know what I think one of the issues that people finally overcame, this will sound silly, but finding a brand new name for both organizations, a brand
Mhm.
new name for an umbrella,
Mhm.
rather than trying to get CADE to join AMTEC, which was
Yes.
where a lot of our conversations were at that point, because we saw distance education as one aspect of a broader issue of educational technology. And
Mhm.
that was threatening,
Yeah.
it didn't work so well. So I think people, people like, well, Chris, you were probably involved in that movement.
No, I really want, I kind of left AmTech, not left, but I hadn't been involved as closely as I had been. So but we talked to Maureen. Maureen Barron was heavily involved in in those conversations. And I think Maureen was actually the first president of CNIE. Is that
Yeah.
Diane? Am I
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I was serving as a Prairies director, I think, at the time that this conversation was happening. So I remember being at the meetings where um, decisions were being made. And I remember Geneviève Gallant being one of the people who was advocating for this. She was part of that there were sort of two small groups that were going back and forth and back and forth that were sort of bringing information to each of the boards, as I
Mhm.
recall. And then I think if I recall correctly, I was actually at the AGM that, ratified this and
Oh, okay.
made CADE and AMTEC part of
Mhm.
CNIE. Because for years I was member of both. But at
Yeah.
some point in your career, you sort of have to think, money
Okay.
wise, which one do I go with,
Yeah.
and so on. Um, so Rick, I guess the other question that I have for you in terms of AMTEC is that how um, you talked a lot about its impact on your career, and I'm just wondering, thinking outside what of that box, sort of what things might have been like had AMTEC not existed. I mean, what would have happened to that little program on the prairies
Yeah. Yeah.
that now actually trains generations of new instructional designers and educational technologists? So, what would have happened to the smaller programs or the programs that were niche in their spaces? Had AMTEC not existed.
I hate to think because I think we would have been so inward looking that we wouldn't have had the same kind of experience and breadth and depth of understanding the role of educational technology and that it needed to play in Canada and
Mhm.
elsewhere, but in Canada, particularly with our organization. We needed that. And I think I'll bet if we went around and asked all those people, they'd have a similar feel for that somehow you'd just become isolated and insulated, and particularly on the prairies. I think we can do that really well and really easily. We're prairie dogs. And so we stick our heads up and we look around, and then we
And
hear a
then
noise
down
and
you
we
go
duck
again.
down on the ground.
Yeah.
If it sounds threatening, we're away. Um, I don't think we would have as rich a palette of understanding of what educational technology is. Here's an interesting one. Just a side story really quickly where that happened. Dennis Lincoln we haven't mentioned him much, but he was a thinker, and I haven't talked to him in years. I don't know how he's doing. If you can get a chance to talk to him, but he wrote a book called Paradigms Regained. And I think about, at the time, I had published a book with the same publisher out of the States. And I remember Dennis saying that publisher told him, well, sometimes I just try and invest in something that I think I'm going to lose money on. Because it was a think piece about semiotic theory and how that informs. It was very Canadian in that respect, right? And you know what? I think that thing became something of a classic because he was talking about things that very few other people were talking about. He worked with John Belland out of the Ohio State University. And so we had this North American connection of people writing about stuff that was obscure at the time. Well, that kind of conversation, if we would have become too isolated and insulated, I don't think we would have had those broader conversations that actually influenced the field a great deal.
Was it a response to Kuhn, or was it separate from his paradigm shift?
I'd have to pick it up and look at it again. It's been a while.
Sounds too close to not have been impacted one or the other to each other.
I think it was. And Dennis just loved raising theoretical and philosophical issues. Mm-hmm. And he was very good at that. And what a neat thing to have sitting by himself, by the way, practically in Winnipeg, trying to make something good happen at the University of Manitoba. So, there were a lot of people like that. There were a lot of people who were one-person programs or one-person influences around the country. And if we hadn't had that place together, gosh, it would have been a quiet, sadder place.
Yeah.
So you talk about something being very Canadian. This is a huge question, I guess, but in historical terms, what do you see the difference between what the American, I would say, evolution in educational technology and the Canadian one? What were the kind of differences in approaches and perspectives? And I know I remember going to a conference in the US. It was similar to your. It was just huge. It's like the whole of Canada would not have had those kind of numbers at this conference.
Yeah. Well, I think it is the influence of that communication theory bent that we had that influenced us. It's not that it doesn't exist in the States, but it's just a greater emphasis here. And I do think that had a practical influence on us. I think instructional design came along later here than it was in the States. And in the States, a lot of the places you talk to were very interested in instructional design for training in industry. Okay? And there seemed to be, because it was a great career path for people. And there were wonderful opportunities for people. So, I mean, that came up a lot. I remember in my grad programs, hearing that a lot and, having an interview with Arthur Anderson in Chicago, that kind of thing. Wow, you could disappear down the industrial rabbit hole here pretty easily. So I think there was more of a government academy and some industry influence where in Canada, where it was much less so that that equality wasn't as evident in the States, and or at least for me. Again, I have to qualify all of this. This is just me with my little narrow binoculars on. Turn my binoculars backwards and look at things. So I could be dead wrong about all that, and I'd love to have a conversation with anybody about it, but I wouldn't be married to any of my opinions.
Yeah. But it's interesting because I think that's what this series of interviews is going to do. It's going to stitch together each individual story. And suddenly sort of a pattern or a landscape starts to emerge that's more of a fleshed out painting, if you like. So everyone's experience will sort of fill in the blanks. And it's
Yeah.
interesting to me because you hit the educational technology, instructional design movement just around the time that some really interesting things were happening. So 1973, AMTEC was 50, or sorry, AECT was 50 years old.
Yeah.
AMTEC had just sort of been created out of 2 or 3 previous organizations that had different foci. And then even in Australia, the Australia movement was starting. The AMTEC equivalent in Australia was created in 1973. So interestingly enough, that seems to have been a very pivotal year, at least from the perspective of these 3 countries. And I'm just thinking, if you're thinking back to when you were a grad student and you're thinking about getting into this, you would have been thinking about doing this around 1973. If you were sort of finished and doing your grad studies in 78. What was it about that year or that time frame that really attracted young academics to this idea of being part of an educational technology future?
Ooh, that's a good one. I feel many cups of coffee coming on here.
Or many other kinds of beverages.
I think my own personal story is pretty narrow and as interesting as it might be. It's probably not emblematic of others. I kind of just backed my way into this field. I was literally had just started a master's in counseling in education at Indiana University, and I was walking down, and I had just come out of a first meeting in my first class in that program, and in that program, and they sat us around and they said, "We want to break into groups and talk to each other about dreams you had last night and how they influence you." And I thought, is that what we're going to do?
I might be in the wrong program.
And I left that class and I was walking down the hallway, and there was a class being taught by Mendel Sherman at Indiana University at the time. And it was a summer class, and he was in there showing how you could use slides to teach people inquiry into how you could using slides of insects to develop inquiry into why coloration of insects are then treated different ways and things like that. And I thought, that matters. I was a teacher and I knew that mattered. And it was different than the way we were teaching in our classes. And it was exciting. And it was something that was an angle, but very practical. It was something I could grab a hold of and then go forward with. So my own story was, and by the way, I left that program that same afternoon and went and applied to IST at Indiana University because I thought these guys are onto something. I thought this is fascinating. And so my personal story, that doesn't really fit into the grand things you
but it actually does, because first of all, how we create a movement is a whole series of individual stories, but your story is not unlike mine. I thought I might like to do a master's and I was interested in public relations. And I don't know if you remember Lily Abbas, but Lily was a student of Mary's. She had done her master's in ed tech. She was a director of public relations. And I thought, well, I'll look into that degree. That might be interesting. It was ed tech. So I had thought I'd like to become a public relations person. And instead, I 2 classes in, fell in love with the concept of how to use technology to teach. And never, ever got into public relations, as much to the regret, I'm sure, of the whole field. But it's interesting how we find ourselves in those particular spaces and making those kinds of decisions.
Well, I know you were really you became such close friends and great colleagues and all that. We all have, but with Mary Kennedy, you guys became the dynamic duo. You were Batman and Robin for a while.
Yes, yes.
And I also was affected by great professors who set my hair on fire. And I wanted, that was something I aspired to. It was something to being able to work with people and be excited about ideas and to talk about things that we found important, whether or not anybody else thought they were important didn't matter. All that kind of thing. It was very attractive. And I think the field of educational technology has that applied plus theoretical aspect that allows us to merge things of interest and then put them immediately into action and apply them to the world.
Yes.
And that's so seductive. It just is.
Yeah. And critical at the moment. I mean, nothing like a global pandemic to set the stage for everything you've done in your 40-year career. To sort of say, okay, I set this all up. Now it's yours to figure out how to use in this odd space.
Yeah. Anyway, well, we're probably running. I'm running you guys long.
No, we're good. As long as you're good.
I'm good.
All right.
I love this stuff.
I have I guess another slightly off-topic question. We talked about AECT and our relationships with with them as part of AMTEC. I also remember at conferences we used to get attendees from the UK, and I know myself and people like Gary and Ray Whitley, we were Commonwealth Relations Trust bursars. So we had.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about AMTEC relationships outside, international relationships outside US?
Yeah. I wish I could more directly, because in the years that I was involved in the governance of AMTEC, we weren't doing a whole lot deliberately, but you're right. People were starting to show up.
Yes.
It was really something. The word got out. And then we had these great people like, well, you and Gary Carlson and Ray Whitley. I mean, people who were involved in the Commonwealth Trust and I never even as president, I didn't even understand the Commonwealth Trust or the AMTEC Trust much. I knew there was some money out there and some kind of thing going on, but it wasn't something I was paying a lot of attention to at the time. But I know it must have been happening very effectively, because you're quite right. People started showing up at our conferences, and to a person, people who came to our conferences from elsewhere were always impressed with the look, feel, and welcoming aspect of AMTEC. It was different. Yeah. It was, so many conferences, and especially academic conferences you go to, they have an edge. People trying to score points or get their name in here and there. I never felt that at AMTEC. I never felt like it was a competition to be recognized or, anything like that. It was just good people getting together. I think that was the defining feature of AMTEC for me, was that it was about people rather than about the technology itself.
True.
And as a grad student, getting to rub shoulders with people whose papers you had just written or read, who they had just written, was, phenomenal.
We were small enough, that helped too.
Yes.
I think small is good.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything you wanted to sort of say finally in terms of, I know, Chris, I don't know if you have any other questions, but
I have one last question.
Oh, please go ahead.
It's more to help us solve a mystery. We're trying to figure out the origins of the AMTEC quilt.
Oh, yes.
The AMTEC quilt?
Oh, God.
I can share screen with you if you want.
Yeah, could you?
Sure.
because
Oh.
I do remember.
Where is it?
Everyone vaguely remembers it. It really does exist, but
Yeah,
nobody
yeah.
can remember how or who, where
Oh
it
dear
came from,
God.
or who
Oh,
created it.
oh dear God. Look at that.
Well,
Sometimes I wonder if it might have been through Barry, because I know his partner was a world-class
Oh yeah,
quilter,
yeah.
but I don't
oh,
know. I don't know if that. I've never suggested that before, but it's something I've thought about. But yeah, the quilt exists, and no, it was never. Nobody signed it, and nobody has left any trail as to where
Yeah.
it came from.
You know, I don't think it was Barry. You're quite right. Yvonne was a superb quilter
Yeah,
and all
she
kinds of
wrote a
things.
book on quilting that I own, actually.
Ah, okay. Okay. Um, I don't think so, but for one reason. Knowing Barry, the quilt would have had some markings from the two conferences we ran in Saskatoon, and I
Right.
don't see them in the
oh,
mix.
In the mix. Good
Now,
point.
maybe it is. Maybe they are. Maybe I just didn't recognize it as blurry enough that I couldn't make it out. But
I can look
we did
closely.
80, we did 87 and 97
Yeah,
hosted the conference, and I'm pretty sure Barry would have gotten that into the mix. You
Yeah.
yeah.
know,
We're
uh,
not even, we can only tell when it was created by the last date that's actually part of it. And is it 96? Chris, was the latest date on it?
The last, yeah, 80s,
there's 2000.
96. No, 2001, we've got Halifax. We got AMTEC 86. Where was it? I don't know. Ross was able to figure out where all these were.
Yeah.
Winds of Change from Lethbridge. Um, yeah, I can't really actually read them here either, so
Is there one on there called Confluence?
I don't
Because
see.
in '83 that was Montreal. That was my first introduction to that lovely city. I love Montreal.
No, I
Uh,
can't see it right now. AMTEC 2002.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's
I'm
it's
sorry.
about 20 years ago. Somebody did this,
Yeah,
and it's
Yeah.
awesome, but we can't for the life of us find anyone. We thought maybe Mary Kennedy would know, and she's not she not even so sure at when we were talking with her if she was even remembering the quilt. So
yeah.
it's we know it's physically present, like it's in Ottawa, I think, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, it's in Ottawa at the CNIE office with Tim.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah.
I'm glad it survived. I wish I could remember its origin. I don't think it was us. I don't think it came out of Saskatchewan. I would have guessed Newfoundland, frankly. That's what.
Well, we were all convinced Mary knew the origin, and she
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and unfortunately, we are not able to ask Genevieve as she passed recently. So it's one of those things where, yeah.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yes, yes. We lost. It's part of the reason why we started this process was we were starting to lose some of our knowledge keepers in
I
terms of
am
their ability to
so.
tell us stories. Yeah,
Oh, I
yeah,
am so sorry to hear that. I love
yeah,
Jean.
yeah.
She she was she was so. We got lost in Montreal one time trying to find a place to eat. Now, how do you not find a place to eat in Montreal? Me.
We lost.
Okay, we're back on.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Sorry. Hi, Chris. Sorry, so I'll just pick up that story. We were talking, and she was going to work with Aaron, who again had this, a massive history in Newfoundland's
Mhm.
educational technology and distance
Right.
ed field. And then I was going with Tony, who had just arrived from the UK. Um, so yeah, it was the last time that we had a chance to really sit down and have a conversation. That was quite a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that raises another thing that I'm glad. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm terrified to hear that. But happy it came up because there was another thing that AMTEC that we were kind of deliberate about, but by the same token, Canada was, and AMTEC was a perfect place to do this. And that was to recognize the importance of gender in what we were doing. We didn't early on have a lot of gender, it wasn't a good old boys club quite in the same sense, but there were a lot of men, not very many women, working particularly in the leadership of AMTEC. And I remember a conversation in Vancouver about this with Genevieve and Katie Campbell, and I think Mary.
Likely.
And we said, you guys got to move into some leadership positions here. Place is welcoming to do that. We got to do that. It's really going to be an important thing over time. And so for the editorship of the journal and for the presidency of AMTEC, we deliberately started trying to position people to move into those roles.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very exciting. And look at the history of our organization and the influence that women have had in the last 20 years on what we've been doing in AMTEC. It's really quite remarkable and quite different, I would suggest, from other locations on the planet.
Yeah.
Well,
no, I don't disagree. So I guess that from my perspective, I'm going to ask you if there's any last sort of notes that you want to make sure we chat about before we end the conversation, which I don't actually want to end, but it's one of those we do need to be respectful of your time and so on. But is there anything any final parting thoughts that memories of AMTEC are bringing to you at the moment?
Well, that gender piece jumped to mind. Thank you. That's why these round conversations are good, right?
Yeah.
But just thank you for including me. And it reminds me, talking to a couple of old friends from AMTEC and being able to spend an hour together with each other, it reminds me what it felt like to be in AMTEC, right? And why exactly what you're talking about and exploring right now is important. Thank you so much, and I miss all of you.
We miss you too.
And it was just great to catch up with you for a bit, and good luck and Godspeed with your project. I don't know how you're ever going to finish it.
I suspect we're not ever going to finish it, because there will always be somebody telling us about someone else that we need to talk to. And so it's been such fun. I mean, we've only sort of scratched the leadership surface, if you like, of the AMTEC history. Thank you so much, Rick. It was such a pleasure to talk with you today. Chris and I are just over the moon with the opportunity to talk with you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll connect again.
Who knows? We might be back for part 2.
You know where to find me. Okay.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rick.